Hello again, this is John Burroughs. I'm going to continue with my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. This is chapter 41, and it's called Official Detective. I guess I'll just give you a little warning like the movies do. It might not be for the squeamish. But anyway, I'll go ahead and start the story. I had returned to Aragon for another attempt at formally graduating high school, but it was less than 2 months into it that I knew I was done with high school. In my mind, the best option for me was to find work of some sort because it was already a foregone conclusion that Georgia and I were going to be married as soon as possible after she graduated. There was no sense in delaying the inevitable. I was going to need enough cash flow to support us. I had no work experience other than my summer job at the machine shop, so I decided that the door-to-door job hunting would be a painstakingly slow process, and aside from future needs, my immediate needs were no longer going to be fully financed like they were while I was attending school. Though it cost me dearly, I got a job at 25th Avenue Shell through an employment agency, working for the $1.85 minimum wage at the time of which the employment agency took 25% of my first 2 months' salary. It had a huge impact on my life, especially when it came to the hours I would be required to work. Excuse me. It was a 10-hour day shift, leaving one day off, Tuesday. The only satisfaction as far as my earnings were concerned was that I received 20 hours overtime each week at time and a half. Being the newbie, I had the prestigious honor of working the closing shift that was from 2 p.m. to midnight. I was also alone from 10 p.m. to midnight. There are those of you who are old enough to remember what a gas station, or shall I say service station, really was. Self-service was unheard of in those days. An attendant would pump your gas, clean your windows, front, back, and sides, check your tire pressure, your oil level, and added oil if you were low, check your radiator and added water or coolant if you were low. If you so desired, you could start the car so your transmission fluid could be checked properly. If business permitted it, you were taken care of by 2 attendants in order to expedite your stay. Imagine all this at 28.9 cents a gallon. All employees were required to wear uniforms, and since I was needed quickly, I was issued a uniform that fit me fairly well, except all the shirts had the name Ron sewed on them. Excuse me again. Ron was the former employee who had to abruptly leave the job without giving notice. I had to wear his uniforms for about 3 to 4 days while mine were being prepared. We were issued 3 pairs of pants and 5 shirts each week. There are a couple of assistant mechanics that worked at the station, Stan and Brent. Stan could have been a character in the Archie comic books. Brent came from money, and cars were a hobby to him. Stan owned a 66 Plymouth Fury that he kept in good shape, and Brent owned a 67 340 cubic inch Cuda that he enjoyed road racing in Katati on his days off. The more I got to know these guys, the more I liked them. However, on the second day working there, both of them came over to me, and Brent said, while suppressing a laugh, "How do you like wearing Ron's shirt?" I was perplexed and could not figure out why he would ask me this question, but I answered, "I never really thought about it." Stan started laughing, which only added to my bewilderment. Stan smoked eerily. "You mean you don't know why Ron no longer works here?" With a tinge of frustration, I answered no, and why should I give an F? Stan said, "I'm going to tell you why," as he stared at me in disbelief, assumedly because I didn't know about Ron. I was now overwhelmed by my curiosity, and though it was about time for Stan to get off, he decided to stick around and tell me about this mystery. Before I begin, has anyone asked you about the name on the shirt? No, was my curt reply. You must understand that Stan and Brent were one of the last bastions of what I will call the American graffiti generation. I hardly knew or cared about cars at the time. I was a member of the budding hippie generation, and the only time I had looked at a newspaper was when I would read the sports section. It may have been coincidental, but the very next day after Stan told me the story, a customer asked me if my name was Ron. Here is the best recollection of Ron's story, as told to me by Stan that night. Ron worked the same shift as I did. Supposedly he was former military, spent a little time in Japan, and was obsessed with personal cleanliness. His shell uniform was always pressed and spotless right down to his non-slip work shoes that shined enough to reflect the station ceiling lights. That was odd because it is virtually impossible to keep your uniform that clean working there. If his shirts or pants got dirty before the uniform company could come pick it up and drop off clean ones, he would take the ones he had home to wash and iron them. It was infinitely more complicated to keep your hands clean all day, but Ron managed to do so even if it meant washing his hands every half hour. As odd as it was, Stan just thought, each to his own. Everybody's take on Ron was that he was respectful of others, and though he was introverted and shy and rarely joined in any of the conversations that took place during work, he never participated in any discussions that involved women or young ladies. This was highly unusual, because one of the greatest perks working at an old-time service station was cleaning that front windshield. If business was slow and some attractive ladies drove in to get some gas, they were never serviced by one attendant alone. In fact, it was a race to see who get to the squeegee fastest and start on that front windshield. Remember, these were the days of miniskirts, and often the view was breathtaking. The ladies knew exactly what was going on, and invariably they would provocatively tease us in order to add to our youthful hormonal frustration. It was a game that both sides enjoyed playing. When a situation like this occurred, and they happened frequently, you could imagine the testosterone-filled conversations that took place inside the station. Stan said that never once did Ron take part in any of them, and would walk outside when they began. If I worked around a guy like that now, I would probably do my best to avoid him, and maybe even express concern to the appropriate person. When you are young, your acceptance threshold is a lot higher. The strange thing about it was everybody knew something was not quite right about him, but his courtesy and respectfulness made you easily overlook his eccentricities. I have worked in many gas stations in my life. However, 25th Avenue Shell's lube bays were configured unlike any I had seen before. It had 3 lube bays, and that was pretty typical. The difference was that the third lube bay was behind the 2 front lube bays, divided by a wall that served as a tool board for the 2 front bays, and the other side of the wall served as a tool board for the third lube bay. The 2 front bays you entered by driving straight ahead as a mechanic guided you in. To enter the third bay, you would drive down an extremely short road on the right side of the station, and then make a left, and you would be guided on just like the front bays. You would not know there was actually a third bay by looking at the front of the station. There was a club across the street where scantily clad women would dance on top of the bar and entertain the drinking customers below for tips. It was a precursor to a modern-day strip club. I have never been inside since I was under 21, and I am sure there were tables available inside. Stan said many of the dancers would come in to get gas or their oil changed. Stan said that one day, a couple of San Mateo police detectives came in asking all the employees if they knew one of the dancers, and if so, when was the last time someone had seen her. No one had seen her recently. The detectives thanked us and left. No one ever thought to ask them why they were looking for her. 2 days later, 2 squad cars came up, and Ron was arrested and driven away in one of the squad cars. The officer in the other car stayed behind to explain to Jim, the owner, exactly why Ron was being arrested. Stan heard the whole explanation. Apparently, when the detectives came by 2 days earlier asking about the girl's whereabouts, they had already found her dead and nude, with nickel-sized holes all over her body. Her head had been caved in. In addition to the holes, they found multiple stab wounds. The detective went on and explained to Jim why Ron had become under suspicion and arrested for the murder. The detectives found the body, and the coroner that examined her was absolutely shocked at the cleanliness of the body. Here was a young girl whose head had been smashed, suffered multiple stab wounds and holes made by yet to be an identified weapon, and the body was spotless. There was no blood, dried or otherwise, found inside or outside of her wounds. She was found wrapped in a plastic sheet, both without any dirt, blood, or fingerprints. These detectives were incredibly observant because when they were at the station, they noticed how Ron was considerably cleaner than anyone else. In fact, they referred to him as spotless. They also took note of the fact that he did not say a word and seemed completely distant from the circumstances. Also, upon leaving the station, they noticed how our road service truck was clean as a whistle, including the bed of the truck. One other small detail caught their eye. There was a tiny brown spot about half the size of a dime on the bumper of the truck. That very well could have been dry blood. They decided to dig into Ron's past. They found out that when he was stationed in Japan while in the military, he was brought in for questioning involving the murder of a young Japanese girl. The Japanese never found sufficient enough evidence to arrest him, but also described him as amazingly respectful and incredibly clean. They had interviewed some of Ron's peers, and they described him much like the way Stan described him to me, especially when there was any talk of women. To the San Mateo detectives, all of this information made them certain that Ron had an emotionally unstable personality, and felt that because of that, they decided it might be worthwhile to try and extract a confession from him. It worked. Not only did Ron decline the lawyer, he made a fully detailed recorded confession of the girl's murder. Here is essentially what Ron told the police that day. The young lady drove into the station about 11:15 on the night of the murder. She had often gassed up there, so she was familiar with me, and I knew she trusted me. On this particular evening, she came in complaining that her car was running really weird. I had already closed and locked the front lube bays in preparation for closing, so I told her to drive it around to the back bay, where I guided her and the car on the rack. Why I did what I did is not important, and I'm not going to say why. I opened the car's hood, and then I pretended to have found the problem. I told her to bend over the fender so I could show her what caused the problem. While she was doing this, I knocked her out with a hammer and then suffocated her until she was no longer breathing. I then stripped her down completely and placed her across the tool bench, where I repeatedly stabbed her. I then took a hammer and punched holes all over her body. I then cleaned every inch of her with strong hand soap and cleaning solvent. I put her car on the hoist and lifted it up in the air. I laid quite a few shop rags in the spot where her left front tire would be if the car were on the ground. Next, I removed her from the tool bench and laid her on the floor with her head resting on the shop rags. I brought her car down, crushing her head. I then entirely cleaned her again, along with all the tools that I had used. I took the shop rags and threw them in the trunk. Excuse me. She was still on the tool bench, and I had backed her car out and parked it outside. I then went back inside and put the immaculately clean body on a sheet and wrapped her in it. I then placed her body in the bed of the service truck. I drove out and dumped the body where you found it, figuring I had pretty well covered my tracks. I then drove the service truck back to the station, put it inside in the back bay, per the closing instructions. I then closed out the till, locked the station, went outside, and hopped into her car and drove it out to the marshes, where I set it on fire and walked away. From what I can recall, Ron was given life without parole. I heard he once said to one of the inmates that it was time to stop this shit, and if I am not in jail, I will never stop. The murder gained a lot of notoriety, and the story was published in Official Detective magazine. I think that was what it was called. It was one of those magazines you would get in a smoke shop that described murders and stuff like that in a graphic nature. Anyway, I never knew the guy, but I still shudder when I think that I wore his shirt for a couple of days. It is a story and experience that deeply impacted me and had to be told. Writing it now sickens me.